Hi, welcome to WoW Flash, the weekly series where we look at the news from World of Warcraft in the past week. This week it's mostly developer news. So first of all, you've probably noticed if you've been following my channel, there's only been a couple of videos sort of brought out, in fact one really during the week. The reason for this, for those who are outside of Europe, is you probably think 2016 is the Olympic year. Not so in Europe, it sort of is. However, there is a tournament on called Euro 2016, which is basically the second biggest football tournament in the world. And given that football is the most popular sport in virtually every European country, this is a pretty big deal for us. So at the moment, I am watching football pretty much all, well, in fact, actually all through the evening, quite frankly. Little gap at the moment. Just watch a very interesting game. We've got Spain-Turkey up next, so I'm just doing this really quickly. Not so much on at the weekend, though, so I'll be able to get 2 or 3 videos out there. There's a couple of content ones in particular I want to get out. So in the last week, what we've had is we've had the PTR go live, and you can copy characters across. It's probably a good idea to do that if you are wondering what it's going to be like when the pre-patch goes live, but before Legion goes live. One thing I would definitely have a look at is trinkets. It might well be that your BIS trinkets are now utter garbage, or will be when the pre-patch comes out. It might well be that some trinkets that you consider to be a bit rubbish are actually really good. It's also worth considering if you're a strength DPS or an agility DPS, looking at some tanking trinkets if you have any. Bonus armor's disappearing, being replaced by a stat that could be useful for your DPS. So you might want to get on PTR, just have a look at them, see how they're playing. Yeah, you're going to notice some differences. So in terms of the big news, Watcher was involved. There was some developer Q&As, quite a lot of them sort of last week, and I reported on some of those. It's what made last week's video really long. I'm just going to try and pick out a few that I don't think were mentioned last week from Watcher. Again, ones that I'm interested in. Some of the things that are said are usually sort of aspirational, and you know, I'm not going to report on things that they say they want to do unless it's likely to have a concrete effect on the end product. So one of the things he talked about was personal loot. Now, personal loot, you can sort of see why they would want to bring personal loot more and more into the game. In fact, if we only had personal loot, we were discussing this in the guild actually after our raid this week, you would have no need for split runs really. You sort of would still have split runs if you did this next thing though, which is that, let's say you're in a dungeon, it's all personal loot, but you've also got a friend there, and you get an item, and your friend would really have liked it, and it's not an upgrade for you. Boo-hoo. You can trade them the shard if you're an enchanter. Aha, in Legion, you can actually trade it to them. So in Legion, even when it's set on personal loot, you can still trade loot, if you wish, if it's not an upgrade for you, and it would be for someone else. This surely, I think this is a good thing, because I think in pugs it would put pressure on more pugs, not all, but on more pugs perhaps to use personal loot instead of master loot, which I think people would prefer, because it still means groups of friends can trade with each other, and you'll, on a personal loot situation, there isn't really any such thing as ninja looting. So for some pugs that would be a good thing. For other ones, it makes no difference. It's not a disadvantage to anyone. Talent change at the start of the dungeon. I think this was mentioned last week, but just to make sure that we're clear on this. So when you get into a dungeon, you have a brief period of time to be able to change your talents. So you don't have to be out soloing doing your world quest with the same talents you expect to do a dungeon with. Now, in terms of the really big thing they mentioned, and it's been like, you know, Blizzard, it seems to me, are the last people to know this, and that's that they're not going to do yearly expansions. If you follow my channel, I have talked about this many, many times. The whole concept of annual expansions, first of all, doesn't suit us, the player. It doesn't suit Blizzard as developers. The only people it can possibly suit are shareholders, I suppose, and the people answerable to the shareholders. Because the thinking is, you bring out an expansion every year, well, people are paying their subs every month, and every year they're having to buy a £40, £50 box set, or whatever it is in dollars. Hasn't worked out that way, has it, though? because, you know, a lot of people have not been paying those subscriptions. And it just doesn't work, because look at where we are now. We're doing the beta now for Legion. The alpha started, what was it, last December, was it? Might have been November, in fact. End of November. So there's going to have been about 10 months of where it's all been open and, you know, people have been able to report on it. In other words, no NDA. 10 months worth. Well, if you're going to have an annual expansion, that means you're basically going to have to start that period of alpha as soon as your expansion comes out. Well, that's not feasible. So, yeah. They've now basically said that the yearly expansions are not going to be a thing. So instead what you do, they actually said, and this blew my mind, they actually said they thought that by having a bigger team they'd be able to get content out faster, and what they actually found was all they ended up was getting more content produced. I mean, that's surely got nothing to do with the number of people working on it. That's entirely to do with how the managers have allocated those people. But at the same time, this is good news for us, and surely good news for the developers. Surely to goodness, developers do not want to be producing an expansion every year, because not only do they have to come up with new content, they have to come up with new systems. They always feel the need to change the class systems and have something new and shiny in it. Whereas from their point of view, it's far better just to produce new content for the same expansion, which is what they're going to do in Legion. They actually think they have quite a lot of it, too much of it, in fact. I don't think there can be too much. One thing they said, there's a few things they said that I completely disagree with. One of which is that with the legendary drops, of course, these are world drops. They sort of drop from dungeon bosses or raid bosses, I assume, and like world quest caches, things like that. And they're trying to replicate the excitement of getting an epic drop in vanilla, because in vanilla, when you were leveling up from round about level 39, I want to say, something like that, or late 30s, something like that, there was a very tiny chance that mobs might drop an epic item. It was very exciting, because epics were extremely rare, even at level cap. Even at level cap to begin with were quite rare. So the idea that you when you got one, and I had a few drop, it was very exciting, and it was. They say they're trying to recreate that. It, unfortunately for me, brings into sharp contrast the fact that we've gone so far up that epic doesn't mean epic anymore, because that's the thing. To generate this excitement, they have to have legendaries drop. Whereas epics are now no longer epic. They're just par for the course. They're blasé. Epics now are as commonplace as blues were in vanilla. So what are we going to do when legendaries become passé? I don't know. They're also trying to suggest that, because the big issue with legendaries is, okay, the difference between people getting good legendaries and not is going to be huge. And they're trying to say, well, actually, the power gap between people getting the best trinkets in Hellfire Citadel and not getting them is an even bigger power gap. First of all, this is not Theorycrafter approved, by the way. I'm not a Theorycrafter, but I don't believe that. Okay, especially if you're talking about just any random legendary, that may be true, because most legendaries are just stat bags. They're useless to you. There will be a small number of legendaries that are useful to you, where there's about a dozen legendaries that could potentially drop, because they may not drop for your spec. They might be useless to your spec, or they might just be useless to the content that you're doing. But they've still got really good stats. It's still high item level. But if you get the really good ones, the ones that if you're a DPS will boost your DPS, or as a healer that way, and tank similar, then the power gap is actually pretty massive. But the other thing is, the other sort of misleading part to their statement is that you knew you would get the trinkets within a reasonable amount of time, as long as you were killing that boss regularly. You were not going to get bad luck forever. Whereas with legendaries, you know, although there's supposed to be bad luck protection in there, there's not really, because again, you could end up using that to get the wrong legendary. Whereas with the trinkets, you could just make sure you were coining the bosses that drop those trinkets, as well as the fact those trinkets might naturally drop anyway, and you just get it awarded to you. You know, it didn't take me that long to get the trinkets. It didn't take anyone in my guild that long to get the trinkets. Some waited longer than others, that's all. So the fact that you can get them more reliably as well just makes that statement a bit more difficult to swallow. They're just trying to allay people's fears about the difference there's going to be between people having these legendaries and not. There is going to be a difference. There just is. We'll just have to see how quickly people can reasonably get them. That's what it's going to come down to. Pristine Servers. I haven't talked about this for a while. Not really going to talk much about it now either. They haven't really. It's a complete non-story at the moment. There was a lot of excitement about the fact that they were talking with the Nostalrius guys, but nothing's really coming of it. They've said, I mean, Watcher said that Pristine Servers are not, and it never was. When the idea of Pristine Servers was mooted, and I did a video on that, and it was very clear these were not something for the people who want vanilla legacy servers. Totally different. He's saying that now. It's not for those people at all. And he's not even saying anything definite about Pristine Servers, and I don't think there's a market for Pristine Servers. Not a big one anyway. I'm not going to say no one's interested, because as soon as you say something like that, someone pipes up, well, I would like them. So that's a complete non-story, and I expect it to continue to be a non-story. Another one, there's a little bunch here. I've not done this deliberately, that I disagree with. He says that he reckons Legion will be the most alt-friendly expansion. No. The reasoning behind this is because of the Order Hall campaign, obviously different for different classes, and because of the artifact stuff, different for different specs even, that's going to have enough difference in so that replayability is a bit better. I don't agree with that, and there's a couple of reasons. The first one is that the Order Hall campaign and the artifact stuff is actually quite a small part of the overall experience. Most of it is just in common with everyone else. There's nothing wrong with that, but yeah, it's still largely the same. The quests you're doing in most zones are largely the same. In fact, you get more difference from your profession quests, I would argue, than from your class. The other thing is that ultimately what's going to slow alts down in Legion is acquiring artifact power, because of the time it's going to take. Now, some people say at a certain point, you know, it's not going to take that much time, a few hours, but it's more time than you have had to do in any previous expansion. This is content acquiring artifact power that you just haven't had to do in any previous expansion. All you've had to do with alts in previous expansions is do whatever content you want to do with them. So if you're into raiding, you just had to go through your LFRs, build your gear up a little bit, and then start doing pug raids or whatever. Now you're going to have to do all that and do the world quest. So that is going to limit the number of alts that you not necessarily can have, but can have and keep up to date. And unless you're someone who can spend a lot of time on alts, in other words, you have no job or life, and you have a desire to do this several times on several different characters, some do, then I would say this is the least alt friendly. But anyway, it doesn't matter in a way, does it? I suppose for most people, as long as you've got stuff to do on your main, do you really mind that it's not going to be easy to maintain an alt? Probably not. There's only so many people who need to maintain alts. In terms of the artifacts, I mean, one issue is, of course, you've got up to 4 if you're druid. Oh my god, but hopefully you don't play all 4 specs as a druid. If you do. But you've got, most people have got 3 specs, that's potentially 3 artifacts. And if you do change between all 3 specs, you might want to maintain those artifacts. And it's how you do that. Of course, you could think to yourself, well, my other 2 are going to be useless while I'm upgrading my first one, but it's not quite like that. After the first, I think it's 12 traits, the amount of artifact power required rises exponentially to close to like 3 million. Not quite 3 million, about 2.85 million or something like that. And they say that one of the figures they came out with, let's say you've got 20 traits in your main artifact. With the amount of artifact power you'll need to get the next one, you've got a choice. You could either spend that artifact power on one more trait, or you could get 5 traits on your other one. So there comes a point where maybe some people will think, as it gets, you need more and more artifact power for your main artifact. Maybe you start to put a few in one of your off-spec artifacts and try and build that up a little bit. Remains to be seen how that all works out. Obviously, you know, if you looked at the amount of artifact power you're going to get off items and you thought, oh my god, how am I ever going to get nearly 3 million of it? It looks pretty bad, but what you've got to remember is there's also artifact knowledge that you'll be acquiring. This increases the amount of artifact power you get from these items, so at some point it'll be doable. But, you know, and Blizzard have said this before, it's going to take months, not weeks. So, and I said this last week, but just to reiterate, if you're thinking in terms of raiding, expect that you're going to do the first raid dungeon or raid without a fully traded artifact. So you're going to have to consider the order you go in. Weekly events are not going to be in Legion for the first month. They don't want to detract from the new Legion content. They don't want people feeling they need to do like time walking dungeons or whatever. So they're not going to be active for the first month. It's quite interesting they said month, because I am hoping, they haven't said this, and I'm not sure they're going to. In fact, a few things that they have said suggest they won't do this. But I was kind of hoping the first raid wouldn't come out for a month, to give everyone a chance to get their characters ready. So I'm still keeping my fingers crossed on that one. I'm not sure they will, but here's hoping. For me, anyway. In terms of doing content like dungeon content, it's one of the things they said before they ever announced Legion is they wanted in the next expansion dungeons to remain relevant. I think Blizzard are going to achieve this. Really do. There's a number of things they have done. First of all, obviously you do the normals, then you can do the heroics, and then it's the mythics. The idea mythics is going to be much more of a core part of doing dungeons, and again that's going to please people who don't like the old queue and sign up thing, because you're going to have to get a group together for that. And of course, if you're going to try and do the harder stuff with the keystone, of course that's in mythic. But then there's another thing they've suggested as well, and that is usually like the signal for you to move from normal to heroic dungeons is you outgear the normal. So the normal can no longer drop stuff that's an upgrade for you. So you won't do normals at all. Now, in Legion, although you will still move to heroic dungeons and largely do those, there's still the potential to get something from normal mode, to the point where they've actually said that you doing a normal mode dungeon, there is a chance, albeit a tiny chance, to get mythic raid quality gear. So from dungeons you can get gear that's the same quality as the people doing mythic raids. Now, that may just mean purely in item level terms. It may not be that you get the awesome trinkets or the tier sets or anything like that. I certainly hope not. But in terms of item level, that's a possibility, albeit a really, really small chance. Now, of course, there comes a point where a chance becomes so small that it doesn't really generate interest, because it's so small, you know it's not going to happen on average in your lifetime if it's really small. So it's just a shock if it ever does happen. But, you know, the idea is that although it might only have a really, really small chance to drop an epic, like a mythic raid quality item, it will have a better chance of dropping something that could still be better than the average drop in a heroic dungeon. So it still means if you've got a bit of time, you've done your heroic dungeon, by all means go into a normal one. Or maybe if you're finding it tough going in the heroic dungeons, still carry on doing normals, because even if your gear, your item level is above the average item level of gear that drops, there's a chance to be lucky. Flying is going to be locked halfway through. They don't say what halfway through means. When you have 3 tiers, an odd number of tiers, it's quite tricky to know what halfway through means. Does it mean literally halfway through? So in other words, halfway through the second tier? Or does it just mean sometime in between the beginning and the end? I don't know. But it's certainly not going to be out and released. We've known that for a long time. It just sounds to me like it may not even be out with the first content patch. So it might be like the next, 7.2 or something, perhaps. In terms of classes, they have said that classes are very much into tuning now. However, he did sort of say that don't expect many mechanics changes, implying that there are still some to come. Unfortunately, this means that people who are getting their hopes up about mechanics changes for their spec will still get their hopes up. I mean, what we're basically taking from this is virtually nobody will be having any mechanics changes. It's just tuning. I don't want to double guess who now, because I mean, I brought out my first introductory rec guide a few weeks ago, thinking that they at least were not going to change any of the baseline abilities. I knew that they'd still be changing talents a little bit, and then they changed one this build, so yay. So I don't want to second guess that, but they are done. But I don't know. They say maybe it implies that there might still be a little mechanical change. Certainly don't expect any big ones though. If the spec you're looking at you just don't like at all, it's not going to be rewritten. It's not going to be torn down and rebuilt. It will be very minor if there's anything at all. So just use that. But it will be tuned. If your issue is this does too little damage or too little healing or whatever, well, it will be tuned. Onto UI features. Again, I talked quite a while ago about the UI. They've made the UI a lot simpler. It takes away a lot of information. They argued that people were sort of lost in all the information. No, not really. Now they've said you can get the information back, but rather than options in the interface options, it's console commands, which would normally mean typing in scripts, like just /console and whatever. I wouldn't worry too much about that. There's bound to be add-ons developed just to be able to allow you to do that. It's just a shame that Blizzard themselves didn't just have an interface options tab for it. But yeah, people are bound to develop add-ons to allow you to get anything back that you wanted to get back. And finally, the Legendary Ring is still going to be working at level 110, albeit weaker. So the idea is they're not going to stop it working. Now, there are some things that are stopped working. If you look on the PTR, or even beta, come to that, the class trinket that drops off Archimond, people will notice that when you get to level 110, it's all red, so that doesn't work at all. Whereas with the Legendary Ring, it will still work. It just gets weaker and weaker as you level up. Now, Blizzard have said that they expect people to, if it's fully upgraded, still use it at level 110, but not for much longer. In other words, they expect them to replace it relatively shortly after reaching level cap. So I think what we take from that is that the effect of the Legendary Ring is not going to be very useful when we're doing endgame dungeons and raids. So that's what I've gleaned. Those are the stories I think have been of interest this week. Just to note, there are going to be 2 or 3 videos out this weekend, as I say, once I've had my fill of football. If you've got any comments, put them below. As usual, if you found this useful, always like, comment and subscribe, and share it with other people you think might be interested. And until next time, see you later.